And now I just want to follow up on a couple things that he's mentioned. He need not stay on the floor if he wants to. He's more than welcome to. But he spent a little bit of time criticizing the individual mandate. I think Harry Truman used to say the only thing new in the world is a history we forgot or never learned. And I just want to take a minute and talk about the history of the individual mandate. The individual mandate was not invented by Barack Obama. Obamacare, which was never invented by Barack Obama. The idea for exchanges in all 50 states, sliding scale tax credit to buy down the cost of health care in those exchanges. The idea that you have an individual mandate that everybody has to buy health care, and if you don't, if you're not eligible for Medicaid or Medicare, you need to get health care. If you don't, there's a fine. That was not Barack Obama's idea. The idea that employers of a certain size, certain number of employees have to provide health care coverage for their folks, that was not a Barack Obama idea. The notion that the insurance companies couldn't deny coverage to folks who had a pre-existing condition, that was not an idea invented by Barack Obama. Obamacare, with those 5 provisions, exchanges in every state, sliding scale tax credits to buy down the cost of the care, individual mandate to make sure that everybody is getting coverage, employer mandate, employers got to cover your employees, prohibition against insurance companies not providing coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. Those 5 ideas have their origin from right here in the United States Senate in 1993. Right here in 1993. And legislation introduced by a Republican senator from Rhode Island, Chafee, co-sponsored by 22 other Republican senators, including the chairman of the Finance Committee, one of the people I most admire here in this body. Those 5 ideas didn't go anywhere in 1993, but you know who took them? A governor of Massachusetts took those 5 ideas and said, maybe we could use those 5 ideas to cover everybody in the state of Massachusetts. And Governor Mitt Romney created Romneycare. And you know what? For the most part, it worked. They covered just about everybody there. Initially, they had problems with affordability, but they've done better over time. And when we worked on the Affordable Care Act, we took that Republican Senate proposal from 1993, we took Romneycare from 2006, and we included in the Affordable Care Act because it was a market-based approach to making sure that everybody who didn't get coverage from their employer, were not eligible for Medicaid, were not eligible for Medicare, could get coverage. We see in this legislation before us tonight not just changes to the tax code, but also a further effort to destabilize the exchanges. Something that this administration, the current administration, spends a lot of time trying to do. It's a Republican idea. It's a market-based approach. They happen to be good ideas. They happen to work in Massachusetts, and they could work in 49 other states if we didn't have an administration and my colleagues in here in this body and in the House trying to destabilize the exchanges. I hope that when this legislation passes and we repeal the individual mandate, that we won't just repeal it, but we'll make it. Why do we have it in the first place? To make sure that young, healthy Americans are going to be getting coverage in the exchanges. You can't just have sick and elderly people in the exchanges. You have some young, healthy people in there too. And that's why we have the individual mandate. And if we're going to get rid of it, well, we need to replace it with something that works at least as effective. At least as effective. And that's one of the things we need to work on going forward between now and 2019 when the individual mandate is repealed under this legislation. I had the privilege of serving as governor of my state, Delaware, for 8 years. During those 8 years, we cut taxes 7 out of 8 years. Cut taxes, 7 out of 8 years. We also balanced our budgets 8 years in a row. We paid down some of our debt. We earned AAA credit ratings for the first time in state history. We still have them. We still have them. We had, for those 8 years, a General Assembly. There was majority Republican in the House, majority Democrat in the Senate. And you know what we did is we actually worked together. We worked together. We used sound budgeting practices. We used sound economic analysis and forecast. We worked together. Not either side got everything they wanted. But in Delaware, we have something we call the Delaware Way. And I describe it the letter C, 4 C's. Communicate, compromise, collaborate, civility. That's it. That's the Delaware Way. Communicate, compromise, collaborate, and use some civility. We don't do much of that around here, and we are the worst for it. During those years, I was privileged to be governor, and we cut taxes 7 out of 8 years. I would read each tax proposal with 4 questions. 1, is it fair? 2, does it foster economic growth or impede it? 3, does it simplify the tax code or make it more complex? 4, what does it do to the deficit? Do we end up in a deficit? Do we end up with a balanced budget? Do we end up with a surplus? Those 4 questions. 20 years later, as we took up tax reform here in the United States Senate, I asked the same 4 questions. Is it fair? Does it foster economic growth? Does it simplify the tax code? What does it do to the budget, to the deficit situation that we face? Those are the 4 questions. Others have already talked about fairness. Let me just say that when you look at what's going to happen in the first couple of years after the passage of this legislation, lower income folks, families, they're going to get a tax cut too. It's not just the wealthy. Low income families will get a tax cut too for a couple of years. Families making $30,000 will benefit. They'll end up lowering taxes for the first, I think, 2 years after the implementation of this legislation. After 3 or 4 years, families making $40,000 and less will be on the losing side. After 5 years, families making $50,000 on the losing side. And after about 8 or 9 years, families making as much as $75,000 will not be paying less taxes. They'll actually be paying more taxes. And meanwhile, folks whose income is, I don't know, $500,000, $1 million and more, for the most part, they will realize very substantial reductions in their taxes. Really substantial reductions. And as that income goes up, the greater are those reductions in their tax obligation. Some people say, is that fair? It depends on who you ask. If you happen to ask the people who are making $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 a year, they probably say, maybe not. Fair for a while, but not for long enough. I mentioned those 8 years I served as governor of our state, how we balanced our budgets, paid down debt, got AAA credit ratings. More jobs were created in those 8 years, Mr. President, than any 8-year history of the state of Delaware. I didn't create any of them. I did not create one of them. I helped create a nurturing environment, though, for job creation in our state so that little businesses could get started and grow into bigger businesses. Bigger businesses could make a profit and hire more people. But tax code is important, an important ingredient in that nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation. Not the only ingredient, but an important ingredient. I think it was Senator Cardin who stood right here in front of me a little bit ago, and he talked about how important it is to have certainty and predictability. That's almost as important as the tax rates, to actually know what we're going to face and not face the uncertainty of rates going up and down and the rules changing in the years to come. But I just want to run through a short list of other ingredients in that nurturing environment that I don't believe we're addressing in these changes to the tax code. One is the common sense regulations. One is common sense regulations. Regulations that protect us, protect our health, our environment, do so in a way that's cost effective. Another is to make sure that we're producing out of our high schools, out of our schools, out of our colleges and universities, our community colleges, people who can read, who can write, who can think, who can use math, who have technology skills, science, engineering, the ability to come out of their schools and go to work in the millions of jobs that are going unfilled these days. Because the skill sets that are demanded by employers for these millions of jobs and got met up by the people who are looking for work for the most part, except about 800,000 people, the DACA folks, who could fill 800,000 of those 3 or 4 million jobs that are unfilled. What's another ingredient? Access to capital, the ability of business to get money, to raise money, to be able to invest in plant and equipment and their employees and their workforce. Another is access, not just to capital, but access to foreign markets, to be able to sell the products that we make here, the services we provide in other countries around the world, and get into those markets. Energy costs. My colleague from Alaska said that, in his comments, he said that one of the things that we ought to become in America is like the superpower for, words of that fixture, superpower of energy. Who invented nuclear energy? We did. We're the Saudi Arabia of coal. We're Saudi Arabia of natural gas. We create, as far as I know, as much electricity from wind and solar as I think any nation on earth, and we need to do a whole lot more, and we can. Healthcare costs. We pay way too much money for healthcare in this country. And actually, we have a pretty good idea of how to bring it down. And one of those good ideas is the exchanges. And if we wouldn't stop undermining them and degrading them and destabilizing them, they'd actually work like they do in Massachusetts and a bunch of other states. Public safety is a key ingredient among the forces and factors that are helpful in creating that nurturing environment. Investing in research and development that can be commercialized, turned into jobs and economic opportunity, hugely important. Protecting intellectual property, protected against cyber attacks. Transportation infrastructure. Earlier this year, the nation's civil engineers, Society of Civil Engineers, evaluated our transportation infrastructure in this country. Again this year, D. D is in dog, because our roads, our highways, and bridges are in deplorable shape in many parts around this country. Do we invest any money in this tax bill? If I had $1 trillion to invest in this country to strengthen our economy, I'd put it in infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, rail, ports, airports, broadband, just deploying broadband in vast areas of the country, in rural areas of the country where we don't have access to the internet. That's what I would do. We don't do any of that in this legislation. So, in terms of economic growth and jobs creation, what we're told by most economists is, sadly, a lot of the companies that will make extra money realize greater profits from these changes in the tax code. Majority of them, according not to me, but economists are a lot smarter than me, say a good deal of that money is going to go not to further investments in plant and equipment, not to R&D, not into their workforces. It'll be turned into dividends and stock buybacks, and not to create the kind of economic growth that we all want. Let me talk a minute about the third question I always ask about tax reform proposals, and that is, does it simplify the tax code or make it more complex? During our markup, our vote and debate in the Finance Committee on the proposals, one of my colleagues, I think it was Senator McCaskill, had a stack about this tall of the tax code, federal tax code. And one of our expert witnesses from the Joint Tax Committee was asked, will this legislation that's before us tonight, will it actually make that stack of books which make up the tax, is it going to make it smaller? He said, no, quite the opposite, it's going to make it larger. Now, the idea of doubling the standard deduction, enabling more people to not have to itemize their taxes, that makes the tax code simpler. That's a good idea. But overall, when you look at all the other changes in this legislation, that stack, which represents the tax code, is not going to go down. Ultimately, it's going to go up. Not my words, the testimony of the Joint Tax Committee. And lastly, what is going to be the effect of this package of tax changes what is going to be the effect on budget deficits? And here's where I think we really missed the boat. When Bill Clinton became president in 1993, we were in a deficit. We're in a recession. and he became president. 8 years later, when he turned the reins over to George W. Bush, in those 8 years, more jobs were created than any 8-year period in the history of in the history of the United States. More. And then on top of that, the last 4 years of that administration, 1998, 99, 2000, 2001, we had balanced budgets, surpluses. And when the reins of leadership were turned over to the next administration, to George W. Bush, I think CBO was forecasting a budget surplus of at least $5 billion, probably more. There was a concern that we were actually going the surpluses too fast. Well, it didn't take too long for the surpluses to be eliminated. And when that administration came to an end, we are in the worst economic recession since the Great Depression. We call it the Great Recession. We went from 4 years of surpluses to the worst economy since 1930s. And that's what Barack Obama and Joe Biden and a new Congress in 2009 inherited. I know some of my colleagues think that there's not been any kind of economic recovery. Just look at where we were in 2008 and 2009. For the last 8 years, we've had economic growth, job creation in 8 consecutive years. I don't think we've ever seen that kind of that sustained economic growth in the history of our country. And instead of paying down debt after 8 years of economic growth, job creation, we actually last year increased the deficit by $666 billion. $666 billion. And with this legislation, we're going to add another roughly $2 trillion to our debt over the next 10 years. This is a missed opportunity, folks. It didn't have to be this way. There are good ideas in this legislation. Your corporate tax rate is too high. Let's bring it down. I'm for that. Standard deduction ought to be double. I think Democrats are for that. The child tax credit ought to be increased, maybe doubled, made refundable to help lower-income families too. I'm for that. Capital gains rate, maintained where it is. I'm for that. Repatriation of overseas profits. I'm for that. There's a lot of things I think we could actually serve as a foundation on which we could come to agreement on bipartisan legislation. And we never, as far as I'm concerned, we never really had a fair chance. I'll close with an African proverb. My friend Senator Scott is about to follow me here. He's heard me say this before. But an old African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, to travel alone. If you want to go far, travel together. If you want to go fast, travel alone. If you want to go far, travel together. We should have traveled this road together. We should have traveled this road together. And if we had, we would have maybe some short-term pain, but long-term gain. But I fear with this legislation, it'll be just the opposite. There's going to be some short-term gain, but I fear in the long run, long-term pain.